Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's event with Professor Thomas Juneau. This is one of a series of events sponsored by the Bill Graham Center for Contemporary International History and our partners in this series, the Canadian Arab Institute, a series of invited talks on perspectives on a changing Middle East. And it's a real treat to bring Thomas Juneau here tonight. Tom is an assistant professor at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, and his research focuses mostly on the Middle East, in particular Iran, Yemen, Syria, as well as U.S. foreign policy in the region. And he's also interested in Canadian foreign and defense policy and in analytical methods. Perhaps his principal publication is Squandered Opportunity, Neoclassical Realism and Iranian Foreign Policy, which I believe tonight's talk draws upon extensively. I think he even has copies of the book available. He has published many articles and book chapters on the Middle East, international relations theories, and pedagogical methods. And prior to joining the University of Ottawa, he worked for the Department of National Defense from 2003 to 2014. Chiefly as a strategic analyst covering the Middle East, although he has also been a policy officer and an assistant to the Deputy Minister. So without further ado, let me ask you to join me in welcoming Professor Thomas Juneau. Tom?
Thank you very much, Jack. Thank you very much to the Canadian Arab Institute and the Bill Graham Center for this very nice invitation, and thank you very much also to everybody for being here. So as Jack said, I will speak for roughly 30 to 40 minutes on Iranian foreign policy. I will start very general and then gradually zoom in, finishing with the nuclear program, and then in the Q&A, if you have more specific questions on recent or current developments, we can focus on that, or whichever aspect you're interested in. So I don't have an extensive PowerPoint. I just thought that a map would be nice for some parts of the argument of the presentation. But I think, I do enough PowerPoints in my classes during the day that in the evening I thought I would give that a break. So there are three parts to my presentation. I will start by giving a big picture analysis of Iran's international posture, of what is Iran's place in the regional balance of power. And the bottom line will be to discuss Iran's strategic loneliness and how that impacts its foreign policy. After that, I will give an analysis of what Iran, given its international posture, has achieved with its foreign policy, mostly in the last 15 years, mostly since 2001. And then to finish, I'll conclude with a few points on the nuclear program and what everything I said in the first two parts imply in terms of understanding what Iran did, why Iran engaged in negotiations, which led to a nuclear deal last summer, just about 3 months ago. So what I propose to begin is to take a step back and look at Iran's international posture. It's essential to do this, and in the case of Iran, I find that too often we neglect this step. There are too many automatic assumptions in terms of what Iran is, what it does, whether you take a very critical or a less critical view of Iran's policies. We tend to forget where Iran sits. Because Iran's posture, Iran's place in the regional balance of power has a major impact on its margin of maneuver, on what it can and what it cannot do in terms of its foreign policy. And my bottom line is that Iran suffers from what some can call a form of strategic loneliness. This is partly the result of some of its actions, especially some of its recent actions since 1979, but mostly it's the result of factors that are inherent to its place in the regional balance of power. It's something that is independent of its actions or of its policies. So what do I mean by strategic loneliness? First, I mean that Iran's baseline perception is one of threat and encirclement. And by baseline perception, I mean the perception of whoever sits in government offices in Tehran, looking at the world, looking at the region. It is simply the result of Iran's neighborhood in that sense. Second, Iran naturally mistrusts the international and especially the regional systems because its position in it is so inherently vulnerable. And again, this is a baseline of mistrust that is independent of who governs in Iran, it is one that is largely unavoidable. Not to say that what people do in Tehran doesn't matter, but it is a baseline of mistrust that is largely unavoidable. Third, because of its encirclement, because of this baseline of mistrust, it is normal for Iran to seek partners in the periphery. This means that relations with its first circle of neighbors are inherently competitive, and I'll get into a bit of detail on that in a few minutes. But it means that allies can emerge for Iran in the outer ring, not in its immediate periphery. So under the Shah, before the revolution in 1979, that meant, among others, relations with Israel. It meant relations with Ethiopia. Under the Islamic Republic, it means relations in particular with Hezbollah, with Syria, who are in the periphery, if you want, or in the second ring of Iran's neighbors. Fourth, looking at this strategic loneliness, if you look at things from the outside in and not from Iran looking outside, you understand why it's normal for Iran's immediate neighbors to perceive Iran as a competitor, as an aspiring regional power whose ambitions can only come at the expense of their own. So this is a direct result of Iran's own position that others view basically the other side of the ledger. That is why Iran's relations, or that is partly why, and again, speaking in schematic terms, Iran's relations with many of its neighbors are inherently competitive, inherently mistrustful. And this is not something that is dependent on or the result of the policies of the Islamic Republic. Iran and Saudi Arabia were rivals under the Shah, for example. Iran and Iraq were rivals before and after too. And that is always something that is very important to remember, that even though some of the Islamic Republic's policies have made these inherently competitive relations worse, it is something that is very difficult to avoid, whoever governs in Iran and obviously whoever governs in the neighbors too. So on this basis of that, this gives you just really a broad introduction of where Iran sits. The next step is to emphasize elements of continuity in Iran's foreign policy. There are some important elements in the country's foreign policy that have not changed over the decades, over the centuries for that matter. There are some factors that affect the country's foreign policy, irrespective of the nature of the regime in Tehran and irrespective of its specific policies. The first one that obviously matters is the fact that Iran is a country that has a vast pool or a large pool of potential assets. Iran is potentially a very powerful country. Today, or in the past few decades, we talk about its obviously large reserves of oil and natural gas. Iran has a central geographic position. It's strategic real estate, as one author puts it. Iran has a large population, one of the largest populations in the Middle East. And these may seem obvious, but it's important to emphasize these points when trying to understand where Iran sits in the regional balance of power. Because it's a basic rule of international politics that countries that aspire to be powerful are ambitious, or countries that have large pools of assets will be ambitious, irrespective of their rulers. And this is no different in Iran than anywhere else. And in this respect, it's important to keep in mind that Iran, on many aspects, is a normal country. It's a potentially powerful country that has important regional ambitions, whoever governs in Tehran. The main objective of the Shah's foreign policy until 1979, until the Islamic Revolution, was for Iran to be the dominant power in the Persian Gulf, just south of Iran, and to be a key regional power in the broader Middle East. It's exactly the same ambition under the Islamic Republic. It's important, especially when we look at criticism of the Islamic Republic coming from the Middle East, coming from the US, this idea of an aspiring hegemon in the Middle East. Whatever we think of these exact critics, this is not something that is new. This is something that is normal for Iran. It's exactly the same objective pre and post 1979. The means to get there have changed. The means to get there have changed a lot in terms of the relationships, in terms of the rhetoric that goes with it, but the basic objective is exactly the same. And that is something that we need to always remember. So if we break this down a bit, one of the first elements of continuity for any country that we need to take a more careful look at is always geography. Geography shapes a lot of the constraints on Iran's foreign policy. Geography, I'm not deterministic in terms of the importance of geography. Geography is not the only factor that matters, but still, geography can push a country in certain directions. It can, without necessarily preventing it from going in other directions, it can increase the costs. It can imply incentives to go in a certain direction and not the other one. So in the case of Iran, there's a few points that are important to make. For example, because of topography, Iran does not have major cities on the Persian Gulf. Its cities on the southern coast, on the Persian Gulf, are not very large. Iranian population centers are and have historically been high up on the central plateau. In part because of this, not only, it's important not to be deterministic, but in part because of this, Iran is not and has never been a maritime power. Even at the height of various eras of Iranian power over the centuries, over the millennia, it was a land power, predominantly, not a maritime power. This central plateau, where the main population centers are, gradually descends westwards into the central plains of Mesopotamia. So this gradual descent acts in a way, and again, keeping in mind that this is schematic, we're not making this iron rules of Iranian history, this gradual descent has historically acted as a funnel for Iranian engagement towards the west. And when I say west, I mean just towards the west, including with the Middle East, the Arab Middle East, and for Western engagement towards Iran. In that sense, Iran has been invaded or has invaded in that direction 11 times in its history over the last 2,500 years. Towards the east, however, are largely empty and inhospitable deserts. Iran has been invaded or has invaded towards the east only 3 times. So again, this is an example of how geography shapes the constraints of Iranian engagement with its region. Now coming back a bit to the strategic loneliness aspect, Iran also lives in an environment where clashes of ambition are more or less unavoidable. Iran, many people will emphasize that it's the only ethnically Persian state with Arabs to the south and the west and other ethnic groups in other directions, the only Shia state. For some people, that's important. Personally, for me, the ethno-sectarian aspects are secondary. They're symptoms, they're not causes, but that's open for debate. From my perspective, more importantly, Iran is surrounded by a high number of political entities that have their own ambitions. I talked about how Iran is naturally, as a normal state, is ambitious because of its population centers, because of its geographic position, and so on. The same can be said for a lot of Iran's neighbors, actually for an unusually high number of Iran's neighbors, who have themselves historically and today and in the future sought regional or great power status. To the north, we can barely see it on this map, but Iran almost shares a maritime border with Russia. I'll get into a bit more detail later on, but historically, Iran's perceptions of Russia have been excessively mistrustful, excessively suspicious, and in many cases with very good reason. So this idea that Iran and Russia today are allies, they're close partners in Syria, for example, or in dealing with the nuclear program, in my mind is more or less a myth in the sense that it doesn't reflect the reality of the intense competition between these two countries. From a Western perspective, we see them as opposed to us, but that doesn't make them as close partners or allies as we often make them to be. To the northwest is Turkey, which for centuries was, as the Ottoman Empire and other entities before that, one of Iran's main regional rivals. Again, Iran and Turkey, even though you often hear this idea that their border has been stable for more than 400 years, which technically is true, doesn't make them close friends today. They have highly divergent interests, whether it's in Syria, pretty obviously, but in terms of the nuclear program or other aspects of Iran's foreign policy. To the west is Iraq. Iraq is interesting because obviously it's a young political entity, depending on how you count, 70, 80, or 90 years old, not more than that. But the way, and this is where geography matters, the way borders are drawn between Iraq and Iran, it makes them inextricably linked. Anything, caricaturing just a bit, but anything that happens in one country has an automatic impact on the other. The power and ambitions of any of the two will have an automatic impact on the other one. Insecurity in one will have an automatic impact on the other. And this has a major impact on how Iran views Iraq, especially since 2003, but before that too. And I'll get into a bit more detail after that. But if we, and I have a geographical map here, you can see that more or less the southern half of that border is an open plain. It's not mountainous, which is one reason why exchanges between the two countries are very active, very dynamic. To the south is Saudi Arabia, like Iraq, a relatively recent creation as a state, only a few decades old, but fundamentally, keeping in mind the very broad geographical sweep that I'm trying to make to begin, Saudi Arabia and Iran are the two largest states on the Persian Gulf, in geographical terms at least. So it is inevitable that in terms of the quest for influence, for control of the Persian Gulf, they are automatic rivals. And it's important to keep in mind, for example, that even in the 1970s, when both were allies of the US, tension was very high between them. Not quite as high as today, but they were still very high. So the bottom line really is that Iran lives in a highly competitive regional environment where clashes of ambitions, clashes of interests are very intense and to some extent unavoidable. And again, I don't want to give the impression that I'm into historical or geographical determinism. I'm not pushing the argument that far, but it's important to keep in mind these broad rules of Iran's place in the region, where it fits in its region. The Shah, who ruled Iran until 1979, to a large extent viewed the region through a similar fundamental lens. The way he expressed it, the way the identity he brought to bear on his foreign policy was obviously very different. Pro-US before 79, against the US after 79. But still, there was this large commonality in terms of the strategic loneliness, the intense clashes of ambitions with the neighbors that are a very important fundamental element of continuity in the country's foreign policy. For the Shah, the main enemies, the main threat came from Arab radicalism, Nasser, Iraq, and so on, and from the Soviet Union. For Iran post-1979, the main threat comes from the US, from Israel, in terms of their perception, in terms of their rhetoric at least, but fundamentally the dynamic is more similar than we often make it to be. So really to emphasize, this condition of strategic loneliness is structural. It's shaped by factors that are inherent to the region, to the region's geography, to the region's balance of power, and it really is the starting point to understand Iran's foreign policy. So how does this play out in terms of Iran's key bilateral relations? So starting to zoom in a bit more, going from the very general to the sort of general now. Russia is a very interesting case. And the US, especially now with Syria, with the nuclear program, the US is often concerned about Russia-Iran cooperation, about this idea, this prospect of a Russia-Iran alliance. But really, as I briefly said a few minutes ago, the history of the relationship between the two is one marked by divergence of interests, much more than cooperation. Sustained cooperation, especially in the last 10 to 20 years, has often been a stated goal, but in practice it's never been a sustained reality. Russia's core interests with regards to Iran, with regards to the Persian Gulf, have stayed relatively constant throughout history. Iran is part of Russia's soft underbelly, and I mean Russia, I mean the USSR before that, Tsarist Russia before that. Russia's core interest is to maximize its security, to prevent insecurity from radiating up north. Russia wants to have influence in the Persian Gulf, in the broader Middle East. And in this sense, this is something that can easily clash with Iran's interest. Recently, Russia has also defined its regional interests more through the prism of its relationship with the US. And here it's very important to remember, to keep in mind that when Russia looks at Iran, it primarily looks at Iran through the prism of its interaction with the US. So when came time for nuclear negotiations, when Iran really needed the support of Russia at the Security Council, Russia jettisoned Iran when it felt that it was in its interest to do so, when it wanted Iran to be sanctioned, when it thought that Iran was getting a bit too assertive. And in this sense, Iran was systematically disappointed or frustrated at the lack of cooperation from Russia. China is much less of a player than Russia in the Middle East, especially right now. It keeps a much lower profile. And it is important to note that there are some common interests between Iran and China. From Iran's perspective, China is a major energy consumer, complementary with Iran as an energy exporter. Given Iran's identity post-1979, China has no colonial past in the Middle East, unlike Europe, unlike Russia, unlike the US, and Iranian perceptions. That makes China a bit more attractive. From the Chinese perspective, Iran in many aspects represents the essence of what it's trying to do in the Middle East, in the sense that one way that China looks at the Middle East is to try to leverage difficult relations between regional powers and the US to its own benefit. So in that sense, Iran is not to say an obvious, but more or less an easy client in that sense. But the relationship between Iran and China is primarily economic. Iran would like to see it migrate on more political grounds, on more strategic grounds, but China has resisted that, to Iran's disappointment. Why has China resisted that? For a number of reasons. China, like Russia, views its relationship with Iran through the prism of its relation with the US. It calibrates different interests in that sense. China also views its relationship with Iran through the prism of its relationships with Arab states. China is very careful not to put all of its eggs in the Iranian basket if that would cost it in its relations, especially with Saudi Arabia, but also with the UAE, with which it has growing relationships, primarily built on energy, but not exclusively. The Persian Gulf now, to go into a bit more detail at that level. So there's a few consistent themes in terms of Iran's approach to the Persian Gulf. One of them is the position that Iran occupies in relation to the Gulf itself. Any region, any regime in Iran will see itself, will perceive itself, will have the ambition of being the dominant power in the Persian Gulf. As a direct result of that, Arab states on the southern shore of the Gulf, primarily Saudi Arabia, but also Iraq, will view Iranian actions largely through the prism of these ambitions and will more or less automatically seek to counter these ambitions. And again, the role of the US, especially post-1979, is absolutely central. Regional actors, especially in a more recent context, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, they view Iran through the prism of their fear that Iran would, not exclusively, but that's one factor coming in, their fear that Iran would get closer to the US, which would come at their own expense. They are very protective of their privileged relationship with the US and fear losing that. So one reason why these states, and I'll get back to that at the end, but were skeptical, not to say sort of hostile towards the nuclear negotiations, was the fear that their privileged relationship with the US would be a victim of these negotiations. For these Persian Gulf states, on the southern shore, in a way, the situation that we had until last year was not ideal, but maybe optimal, maybe the least bad, in the sense that Iran was isolated, Iran was sanctioned, Iran had hostile relations with the US and a number of other actors, which from their perspective allowed them to achieve at least some of their interests of countering Iranian ambitions. So again, what we see in this sense from the Persian Gulf, from China, from Russia, from Iraq is, and I'm getting to Iraq in a second, but is regional forces converging to constrain Iran, right? Regional forces having a fundamental common interest, despite all of their other divergences, which are many, you have to keep that in mind, having a common interest in countering Iranian ambitions. Iraq is an interesting case. Post-2003, Iran has emerged as the most influential actor in Iraq, most influential external actor in Iraq. There are a number of trends which have converged, which have allowed Iran to really position itself as a dominant player in Iraqi affairs. Obviously, the collapse of the Iraqi state, post-invasion, individual Iraqi factions, especially but not exclusively Shia, needed external support, needed external patrons. Iran was there. Remember what I said a few minutes ago, that because of geography, the two countries are inextricably linked. Important to keep in mind that Iran has very close ties with a number of Kurdish factions, too, including some of the ones that Canada is actively supporting, which is something that is not the topic of my presentation, but that we're not really discussing in this country, but is a very interesting aspect to everything going on in Iraq. And the third reason why Iran had a lot of success in penetrating Iran was the absence of other regional powers. After 2003, Saudi Arabia largely stayed out of Iraq. So did Turkey. Iraq in itself didn't exist as a state. Iran was the only regional power to really go inside Iraq after 2003. So there was a vacuum that Iran was able to capitalize on in many ways. The problem, though, for Iran is that slowly, and I do want to emphasize slowly, these three trends are closing down. These three factors that have converged to allow Iran to play a strong role in Iraq in the mid to longer term will start playing against Iran in terms of its ability to influence events in Iraq. The emergence of Islamic State in Iraq, its explosion on the scene in the last couple of years, has slowed this down. So in many ways has allowed Iran to increase its influence in Iraq after steady losses in recent years. Because it has, by weakening the Iraqi state, it has reopened space for Iran to penetrate Iraq. It has recreated a need for Iraqi actors, especially militias, to gain external support, which Iran is obviously all too happy to provide. But the rule of thumb, if you want, in looking at the relationship between Iraq and Iran, is that the stronger the Iraqi state is, the more closed it is to Iranian penetration. In the sense that if Iraq is a weak state, as it was after 2003, as it has become again after the explosion of Islamic State onto the scene in the last couple of years, that opens space for Iran. And Iran will automatically be the most influential actor because it's there, because it's right there, irrespective of its ideology, irrespective of what's going on specifically in Baghdad. But as Iraq rebuilds, and I want to emphasize the slowly here. I'm not pretending that Islamic State will be gone in the next 6 months or that the Iraqi state will be the Switzerland of the Middle East in the next year or so. But as Iraq rebuilds, which could happen, which is likely to happen at least to some extent over the coming years, automatically, this is a loss for Iran. This costs it influence on the ground in Iran. So all of this illustrates why characteristics that are inherent to the regional balance of power, just to the way that the map is configured in the Middle East, shapes Iran's strategic loneliness, how there are strong structural or geographic or regional constraints that hinder Iran's ability to influence the region, to project its power throughout the region. And I'll get into some other cases as we move along. But really, that's the bottom line of the first part of my presentation, the importance of regional constraints on Iran's ability to project its power. In my second part, what I want to do is to move beyond the constraints on Iran's ability to project its power to analyzing its actual projection of power. How did it score in terms of influencing regional events, given how stacked the deck is against it to some extent, given what I said in the first few minutes. So the first thing to do is to define success. How do you know if Iran has been successful with its foreign policy or not? It's easy for me to say that I don't think Iran has been very successful, but how would I define success? How do I score Iran? Iran's ambition is to be the dominant power in the Persian Gulf and a regional power in the broader Middle East, an indispensable power in the broader region. And as I said, this is nothing new. This is something that was the case before 1979 too. And my conclusion is straightforward. Iran failed in achieving this ambition. In some issue areas, in some countries, Iran was closer to achieving this ambition. In other areas, it was not. And this is not something that I think will change anytime soon, including, as I will conclude with, in the wake of the nuclear agreement from this summer. The first reason why Iran never achieved its ambitions of regional leadership, of regional influence, is that its capabilities never matched its ambitions. Iran has not generated sufficient assets, sufficient power to really achieve the level of influence that it wants to achieve and, frankly, that it could achieve. Iran's performance in this sense has been suboptimal. So I don't want to use that term too much because it sounds a bit too technical, but the idea of suboptimal foreign policy is that Iran has not achieved its ambition and it has not achieved its potential of being a dominant regional power. Yet Iran could have, and that's why the title of my book is Squandered Opportunity. After 2001, Iran faced a window. Iran faced a window of opportunity whereby it could have achieved its status, its ambition of being a dominant regional power. Remember what happened after 2001. Afghanistan falls. The Taliban were a check on Iran on the eastern side. 2003, Iraq falls. Saddam was a check on Iran's power projection on the western side. In the years after that, Hamas and Hezbollah, for reasons proper to their own domestic context in Lebanon and the Palestinian territory, are on the rise. Oil prices shoot up, and Iran's access to cash, which is obviously a currency to achieve influence, shoots up too. Iran in the years between 2005 and 2009 had access to roughly 3 times more money in annualized terms as it did in the 1990s. That should make a difference in terms of your ability to achieve something with your foreign policy. But Iran's flaw, if you want, is that its assets never matched its rhetoric, never matched its potential. The growth in Iranian power, first of all, that I just described after 2001, in military terms, never followed. Iran developed asymmetric or unconventional military capabilities. Iran developed its missile capabilities. Iran developed its anti-ship capabilities. But Iran's conventional army is today quite weak. Most of the major weapon systems in Iran's military date from the Shah's era, from the 1970s or before, fighter aircraft, tanks, destroyers, frigates, and so on. Those major weapon systems that are post-1979 are not very advanced. They were either developed in Iran or bought from other states which did agree to sell weapons technologies to Iran, but sold them equipment that is not particularly good, to put it simply. Iran's conventional military power has very little power projection abilities. Iran has very weak logistics abilities to sustain large-scale, and I do emphasize large-scale operations here. This is a bit abstract in the sense that nobody's talking about invading other countries in the case of Iran, but if Iran wanted to, it couldn't really do it. It just doesn't have the power to do it. At the economic level, Iran's economy suffers from important structural flaws, corruption, bloated public sector, overdependence on the hydrocarbon sector, and the list goes on. But overall, Iran's economy is really not at the level that it could be given its very well-educated population, given its large population, and given its wealth of natural resources. So this is really the foundation to analyze another foundation after the structural level, the fact that Iran's power, which is really the currency to achieve influence, is suboptimal. It's really below what Iran would need to achieve its ambitions. It just doesn't have the assets in its toolkit to achieve its ambition. One example that I find is very illustrative of this broader assessment is Iran's maritime power. Iran, in military terms, we say that it can do sea denial but not sea control. Iran has the assets, anti-ship missiles, for example, to prevent other navies from operating in the Persian Gulf. But Iran doesn't have sufficient assets to itself control maritime traffic in the Persian Gulf. It just doesn't have the frigates and the destroyers and the crew and all the large ships, basically, that you would need for that. All it can do is spoil or deny, but it can't actually influence. And this is a broader point about Iran's assets. Iran doesn't really have the ability, the assets needed to generate influence, to steer events in directions it wants to, with some important exceptions, and Iraq being one. And I'll get into some of those case-by-case studies. So Iraq, to begin, is that one exception where Iran does have the ability to shape events to some extent. Let's not go through the whole history of Iraq again, but post-2003, the US invades. Post-Saddam, Iraq is highly unstable, very fledgling democracy. A number of actors seek and obtain Iranian support. These actors include political parties, and they also include militias. Iran had twin objectives in Iraq. The first one was deterrence. Iran did not want to be next. Iran did not want the US to attack Iran using Iraq as a base. So a lot of what Iran was doing in Iraq was to prevent that outcome. And in that sense, Iran had success, in the sense that, among other things, by developing retaliatory assets in Iraq against US forces, Iran was able to increase the cost to the US, in Iraq but elsewhere too, of saying, well, if you do try to invade Iran next, it will be extremely costly. And this may seem a bit absurd to say that, but if we remember in 2003 and 2004, there were some people in the US who were seriously thinking about this. And after that, in 2006 and 2007, the idea of a massive or large-scale attack on Iran became pretty much out of the question. But the idea of strikes on Iran because of its nuclear program was on the table. I was personally always skeptical that it would actually happen, but it was on the table. So from Iran's perspective, one of its objectives in Iraq was to develop enough retaliatory assets to make it too costly for the US to attack. And in that sense, it succeeded. Another objective for Iran and Iraq was to basically keep Iraq together, especially by 2006 and 2007, when Iraq was seriously insecure. Remember what I said, insecurity in Iraq has a major impact on Iran. In fact, no other country is more affected by insecurity in Iraq than Iran. That's something that when in the US or elsewhere in the Middle East, when criticizing Iranian policies in Iraq, we tend to forget. Iran was actually affected by all of this more than anybody else. In that sense, Iran's priority for a number of years was to basically keep Iraq alive, to make it survive as a unitary state. Barely, but Iran did play a non-negligible role in ensuring that outcome. So in that sense, it's fair to say that Iran has had some success in Iraq. As I said, the window for that success was starting to close down in 2012 and 2013 as Iraq was rebuilding. Iran's influence was fast decreasing. Iraqi nationalism is very strong. Even among Iraq's Shia, Muqtada al-Sadr, who is sometimes referred to as an ally of Iran, quite hostile to Iranian influence, in fact. And that's the case to various degrees to most Shia actors in Iran. They will take the Iranian support, but more and more they are looking to their own constituencies, not to Iran's interests. Islamic State represented a return of Iranian influence in Iraq, but if or when Islamic State's role or power in Iraq decreases, that will mark a decrease of Iranian influence in the country. The Arab-Israeli conflict and the Levant and Syria is an interesting case. Iran is often portrayed as a major actor in the Levant, and that is really something that I would disagree with. Iran has a very narrow set of tools to shape events in the Levant, in the Palestinian territories, or even in Syria, though 2011 has changed that to some extent. Remember what I said about sea denial versus sea control, about Iran having the ability to block or deny in the maritime domain, but not really to shape or to control or to steer events. In the Levant, in the Arab-Israeli conflict, that is really the case. Iran has the ability to spoil, Iran has the ability to deny through its support to a variety of like-minded or rejectionist actors, violent actors in the Palestinian territories, militant groups, but its ability to actually shape events in the region is very limited. Hezbollah is obviously a very close ally of Iran. They work together, they have common interests, but the more Hezbollah becomes strong, and we have seen this in the last 5 to 10 years, the more autonomous it is in its relationship with Iran. Hezbollah is not a proxy of Iran anymore. That time is done. It's been gone for 10 or 20 years. Hezbollah has its own sources of support, its own domestic constituency in Lebanon that goes beyond the Shia in some cases now, and less it is responding to Iranian demands or Iranian requests. They're still allied. There's still a convergence of interest, but they're allies. It's not a patron-proxy relationship. Hamas. For many years, Hamas was Iran's key ally in the Arab-Israeli conflict. They're not on the same team anymore. Hamas decided that it would not support the Assad regime in the Syrian civil war. Relations are basically cut off now. Iran doesn't provide support to Hamas anymore because they're on opposing sides of the Syrian civil war. There have been attempts at reconciliation in the last couple of years, but they have failed. That is a huge loss for Iran in terms of its influence in the region. And even Syria, in a way, Iran's massive support for the Assad regime has given it large influence on the ground in Syria. That's undeniable. But this is a losing proposition for Iran. Syria will not return to what it was under Assad. there is no way that Iran can do better than cutting its losses in Syria. The best that Iran can hope for is that when, not going to happen soon, I'm not optimistic, but when there is some kind of a post-conflict, post-Assad Syria, Iran is hoping to protect some of its interests, some of its access to Hezbollah in Lebanon through Syria, but that's the most it can hope for. It is not going to get a full-scale ally as it has right now. So in that sense, whatever the outcome of the Syrian civil war is, it's a loss for Iran. And in a way, this is normal because Iran's influence, especially in the decade of the 2000s in the Levant, through its relationship with Syria, Hezbollah, Hamas, that was punching above its weight. That was more than it could hope for, given the distance, given its limited interest all the way over there. Looking ahead a bit in terms of these different areas of Iranian foreign policy. In Iraq, as I said, as the Iraqi state rebuilds, Iraqi political actors are increasingly autonomous. They have their own sources of support. They are less and less responsive to Iranian requests, to Iranian interests. And we have seen this. Iran's relationship with Maliki, who was prime minister until last year in Iraq, were very tense at the end. There was really not that close relationship that we had seen a few years before. The key trend that I'm watching in Iraq right now from Iran's perspective is that Iran's closest allies in Iraq now are militias. They're armed militias. So what does that mean? Iran's ability to shape events in Iraq primarily comes through violence, much less through politics. Not to say that Iran has no political influence, but much less. That has major implications farther down the road. It means that it's annoying for a lot of Iraqis, and you really do see that, not only among the Sunnis and the Kurds, but even among the Shia, this idea that Iran's influence is primarily through violence. Iran is facing growing backlashes in the form of Iraqi nationalism, and that is not going to stop, especially the more Iran paints itself in a corner, being dependent on the use of violence. Now let's get to the nuclear program a bit for just a few minutes before the end. So the one question then that all of this raised, I've been painting a fairly bleak picture of Iran's influence, of Iran's place in the region. Some would argue, though, that because of the nuclear deal, Iranian power will be unshackled and Iran will emerge as a dominant regional power, as I've said since the beginning, is its ambition, is in many ways its natural state. And I don't think that's going to happen for a number of reasons. Not to say that the nuclear deal is not going to help Iran, but really not that much. Things are not, everything, the bottom line assessment I've painted since the beginning is not going to fundamentally change in the wake of the nuclear deal, at least for a number of years. First of all, think in terms of the negative impacts of the nuclear program. The nuclear program has been a major cause of suspicion from regional powers towards Iran. Everything that I've said since the beginning of Iran's strategic loneliness, how regional powers, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Russia, China, are suspicious of Iranian intentions. That's independent of Iran's nuclear ambitions. That's independent of who governs in Tehran. But because of who governs in Tehran, because of the nuclear program, it has made these suspicions even worse. And to a large extent, these suspicions are not gone. They may have diminished in the Obama administration and in those who support the deal in the US, but for Saudi Arabia, for others in the region, if anything, they're worse, because there's this fear that Iran now could break out farther down the road. In my view, an exaggerated fear, an unlikely fear. I don't think Iran will cheat on the nuclear deal, but that's a dominant perception for many in the region. Economically, it's very important also to keep in mind what sanctions have done to Iran. And you can picture this as a counterfactual. Iran today produces about 3 million barrels of oil per day, until even a bit less than that. Until recently, it was about 4 million. Before the revolution, it was 6 million. Iran's potential, in terms of given its resources, given its installations and all that, is to produce about 6 million barrels of oil per day. Because of sanctions, it has been 2 to 3 million barrels of oil per day under that. So to illustrate this whole idea of the suboptimality of Iran not achieving its potential, think for a second, over 35 years, what Iran could have done with all the revenue that would have been generated by these additional 2 to 3 million barrels of oil per day. Right? Canada produces about 3. I don't remember the exact number, but it's about 3. That's a massive amount of money over 35 years that Iran lost because of its own actions. So then the question is, will this change post-nuclear deal? And the answer is no, not that much. First of all, sanction relief will be gradual. It will be incremental. It will not be sudden and massive. Second, many sanctions will remain. One of the biggest points of contentions in the nuclear negotiations over the last 2 years was the idea of nuclear-related sanctions. The US was never willing to budge on that. The US was very clear that non-nuclear related sanctions, that it would define itself what that meant, would not be lifted. So many sanctions will remain in place from the US. What that means is that a lot of Western companies will remain reluctant, at least initially, and when I say initially, I mean for a number of years, to massively invest in Iran. It is true that we have seen lineups of Western and non-Western companies going to Tehran, but they've been going there to inquire about things, to ask questions. It will not be a bonanza for the Iranian economy because sanctions, some of them will remain. On top of that, the regulatory climate, the investment climate in Iran will remain somewhat hostile to foreign investment. Rouhani, the current president, is trying to change that, but with very limited success so far. These things will take a lot of time. There will not be a bonanza of investment in Iran. By the way, one of the major implications of this is that one of the most critical indicators that I will be watching in Iran for the next few years is unfulfilled expectations. The expectations of the Iranian people are sky high right now of economic betterment post-nuclear deal, and that's not going to happen. So for the reformists and for the regime as a whole, this will be a major challenge to manage these expectations when within 1 to 2 years, things will not be getting better very much, very fast. So on this, I think I will stop in terms of my general conclusion of keeping in mind everything I've said, the 3 steps basically. The strategic loneliness of Iran, how regional forces converge to constrain Iran. 2, how Iran's ability to influence events has been very limited, with the partial exception of Iraq, and how all of that is not going to change easily. It's not going to change fast post-nuclear deal because Iran's strategic loneliness is not going anywhere. These regional forces are still there. They're not stopping to constrain Iran, and how the nuclear deal, the JCPOA itself, will not change this reality fundamentally. It will change it at the margins, but it will take a number of years only for the economic aspect to change. So Iran, the idea that we see, so Senator John McCain in the US talking about Iran on the march, which is an expression he uses a lot, not going to happen. And I'm not saying that to pass a judgment on Iran's foreign policy, whether I agree with it or not. Trying to be objective, trying to be non-partisan in looking at this, I still see Iran remaining heavily constrained for the foreseeable future. On that was my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your very complex talk here. What I'm not so sure about is, for example, several things. One of them you said that the Shia-Sunni thing is symptoms rather than as a result of rivalry, another thing. I'm not so sure about that, and I'd like your help understanding it, because the Wahhabis have gone as far as Indonesia, where there is no competition between Saudis and Iran, if you like to call, in which the Sunnis have declared Shia to be heretic. And of course, needless to say, in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and all this stuff is happening, the same thing. It's a pretty hostile environment. So I'm not so sure that you dismissed it as a symptom. It is not, in my views. Another thing you mentioned, there are lots of things, I'm sorry, I didn't keep my notes, is that you said that Iran doesn't have a hammer, so to speak. It only has a defensive capability in some sort of a non-conventional approach, no offensive capabilities. Well, is it possible that that is a thought-out policy? Iran hasn't attacked anyone, number one. Number two, Iran has been drained a great deal by the war imposed on them via United States, via Iraq, and they have been paying a very heavy price for that, both wealth and human resources. Very hostile areas around there. Okay, so it is possible that they're not an aggressive force. Everyone else is, in the sense that, and then you go on to equate that one of the powers, because Iran failed in foreign policy, because it doesn't have aggressive power, I would question that. One could question that approach, because given those conditions and sanctions, Iraq war, all of this stuff going on, it has done rather well. I would say Iran's foreign policy has been quite successful. And that's what I'm suggesting to you. So one can argue that. I'm not going to go into great detail about it, but I would like you to reflect upon it. And why would you think otherwise? Well, there's a whole lot of things, but I'll let us skip out this.
Well, that's a lot of very good points. On the sectarian or Sunni Shia dimension, I think in some aspects I wouldn't disagree with you. I'm not saying that Sunni Shia tensions don't matter, period. Absolutely not. Where I do insist on it, though I recognize that many people disagree on plausible grounds, is as a driver of Iran's foreign policy, as a driver of Iran's naturally tense relationship with Saudi Arabia, with others in the region. The Sunni and Shia aspect is more a consequence of that. It's a mobilizational tool. But fundamentally, in my mind, if Iran were a Sunni power right now, in a completely hypothetical world, it would still have a tense relationship with Saudi Arabia. The context would be different, the rhetoric would be different, it would be expressed differently, but fundamentally, when you have two countries side by side, and I have a very cynical or pragmatic view of these things, maybe that biases my thinking, and I'm more than willing to be transparent on that, but in this sense, it's more power and the quest for power that drives these tense relationships, and not the religious aspect or the ethnic aspect, for that matter. So it's not to say that on other aspects the sectarianism or religious grounds don't matter. It's in the narrow sense of driving Iran's behavior, of driving Iran's its place in the region in that sense. So Saudi Arabia does other things, and that's a separate debate, and in that sense it does matter. No offensive capability, or limited, I didn't say no offensive, but limited offensive capability. Is it thought out? Absolutely. I completely agree with you. Iran is surrounded by states allied with the US. Iran is surrounded by US forces. On conventional grounds, Iran is no match, and it cannot be. What is the rational thing to do in those circumstances? Focus on the unconventional assets. Perfectly. So when you say that you think it's thought out, I completely agree. It's a very rational course of action for a weaker actor to adopt unconventional means when faced with much greater power. In that sense, perfectly rational. Has it been successful or not? Well, then again, that really depends on how you define success, right? And that's why I started, my first point when I started that part of the presentation was to say, what's my criteria for success? My criteria for success for Iran is, has it achieved its potential? In my mind, Iran could be a much more powerful actor. There's a limit to that power because there are serious constraints regionally to Iran's power projection, but even because of that, given some of Iran's decisions, given how some of its policies have generated sanctions, for example. Keep in mind, for example, that fundamentally Iran right now has one state ally in the region, and that's Syria, which is pretty shaky. Iran has a few non-state allies. That's not optimal in that sense. And I'm not counting Venezuela and Nicaragua as allies. That doesn't matter, right? So in that sense, it's suboptimal. So in other ways, if you define success differently, focusing on Iraq, for example, then you can certainly see some areas of success.
Can I add one more question?
Sure.
May I? Just one quick one. You talked about the nuclear program. You talked about the nuclear program, Iran's nuclear program. What I think you missed out is that Iranian nuclear program today or yesterday or day before was really a continuation of Shah's program. Okay, but we conveniently forget that because at that time Shah was a buddy. Okay, but since then Khomeini's, the imams are not their buddies. So I think you have to put this perspective, the nuclear thing, in a proper perspective for us to comprehend it in this continuum of pressure on Iran.
And that, I mean, I don't disagree at all. And that's why a few times, including at the beginning of my presentations, I emphasized elements of continuity in Iran's foreign policy. And I said that there are a lot of the broad objectives, a lot of the broad features of Iran's foreign policy have not changed before and after 1979. Some of the means used to achieve these ends have changed. Some of the rhetoric has changed, a lot of it. Some of the alliances or partnerships have changed, but the nuclear program in that sense, I fully agree, is in continuity. And if anything, the debate that we had for years on what does Iran want with its nuclear program? Is it only civilian nuclear energy? Is it the ability to make the bomb, or is it the actual bomb? That's a debate that was never resolved for the Shah, for that matter.
Hello. The apparent hostility of the Iranian regime to Israel, how much of that is real or rhetorical and for local consumption? And then, similar to this, how much of the Netanyahu government's opposition to Iran and the nuclear deal is real or rhetorical or reflective of reality, to the point that, the Netanyahu went to and addressed both houses of Congress behind the president's back and pushing against that deal?
That's very interesting, and I mean, the first thing to say is that the idea even though the sectarian aspect, the ideological aspect, I put it as secondary in terms of explaining Iran's foreign policy. It does matter to some extent, and it has certainly steered Iran towards hostility towards Israel. That being said, who are two of the most powerful states in the Middle East today? Militarily, economically, and so on, Iran and Israel. Not the only ones, but there's a rivalry there. So in my view, from Israel's perspective, reasons to oppose the nuclear deal, for example, were primarily geopolitical, in the sense that if you're Israel, anything that unshackles Iranian power, if you look at things in zero-sum terms, and if we can agree that if there's one country in the world that views international relations in zero-sum terms, it's Israel. Anything that benefits Iran must be, as a competitor, as a rival, is bad for Israel. Did Netanyahu overreach in opposing that so vocally? I think he did a bit, but I think given the nature of the relationship between Israel and the US, he hasn't paid a price, not yet, and I'm not sure that he will. And if anything, Netanyahu, given his firm intention to keep Iran down, has had some success in the sense that the threat, and I don't want to push the good cop, bad cop analogy too far, but the threat that Israel would attack Iran around 2008, 9, 10, 11, and I was at National Defense over those years, and we were watching that very clearly. And I always stuck to the prediction that he wouldn't, that Israel wouldn't, even before his time, but I wasn't fully convinced of that, right? It was very clear that one of the drivers, not the only one, but one of the drivers that focused minds, in particular in Europe, but also elsewhere, to get a lot of actors to buy into the multilateral sanctions after 2010 was to keep the prospect of an attack off the table. It wasn't the only thing. That would be too simplistic. But from the European perspective, from the Russians, from the Chinese, who did not want an attack on Iran, right? One of the arguments in favor of moving towards much deeper, much larger international sanctions after 2010 through the UN Security Council under Obama was keep the prospect of an attack off the table. So one way to look at everything that Netanyahu did over the years was to play this bad cop routine that pushed the international community, that focused minds towards greater sanctions on Iran. So in that sense, if you look at things in those fairly narrow parameters, and granted it's not the full picture, it worked. Speech to Congress, a bit of the rhetoric. Did he go too far? Many occasions we thought he did, but so far at least he hasn't paid a price. So.
A couple points. You didn't mention Iran's ICBM program at all, that's what delivers the bombs. Secondly, you made a point about Iran not supporting Hamas in Gaza. The last Gaza war started because of continual rocket fire from Gaza. Gaza didn't invent these rockets. They were supplied through the tunnels coming in from Sinai, and those rockets came from Iran. Nobody else is supplying them. Could you answer those, please?
Okay, on the ICBM. In 1999, the US produced the National Intelligence Estimate, which is the overall assessment of the US intelligence community on Iran's ballistic missile program. And in 1999, the consensus view of the US intelligence community was a 50% chance that Iran would have a ballistic missile capable of reaching the United States, the continental United States, by 2015, i.e. now. That assessment over the years has been repeated, manipulated, exaggerated, and so on. The US did not publish a new formal public assessment. Obviously, a lot of stuff happened internally, but a public assessment until a few weeks ago. Now the assessment, so you've had people in Israel, people in the Republican Party, in Saudi Arabia, and Gulf states systematically manipulating the threat, or raising, I shouldn't say manipulate, because that's passing a judgment on my part, but raising the prospect of an Iranian ICBM that would, as you say, deliver nuclear warheads. Make a long story short, finally, a new position of the US intelligence community, not for 5 years, that Iran will have ICBMs. US Secretary of Defense, Ashton Carter, in July, sometime in the last few months, actually caveated that even more, and these are his words, I would not rule out an Iranian ICBM in 10 years. So, in intelligence analysis methodology, I would not rule out, first of all, is poor methodology, because that basically means an above zero chance. That's not very clear. But in everyday usage, I would not rule out implies a relatively low chance in 10 years. Iran is far from having workable ICBMs. Iran is far from having operational ICBMs. Is it 5 or 10 or more years? I don't know. Nobody knows. But it's still very far. It's shorter range missile, intermediate range missiles that can reach Israel, that can reach Southeast Europe, but not beyond that, are unreliable, inaccurate, and poorly tested. They don't have good experience working on them. The tests fail more often than not. Not to say that they don't have that capability, but the idea that Iran would lob missiles on Israel is a non-starter for me for a number of years, because there's no guarantee that it wouldn't fall in Palestinian territories, basically. So that's the Iranian missile threat has to be seriously caveated. It has a missile program, it has progressed, but it's really not as bad as it's often made out to be. Gaza rockets, that's where it becomes more real, because we're talking about short-range rockets up to 200 kilometers in the case of Hezbollah, up to 50 to 100 kilometers in the case of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip. Because, as I said, right, relations with Hamas are more or less severed, but there's still relations with other smaller Palestinian groups in Gaza. There's a number of nuances that have to be brought in here. First of all, Iran is actually a recent supporter of Palestinian groups. Until the 90s, and even until the early 2000s, the main supporters of Palestinian groups were Saudi Arabia, other Arab states, non-state actors in the Arab world. As these states, especially Saudi Arabia, started reducing their support to Hamas and Islamic Jihad and others, the whole, constellation of smaller Palestinian groups, then steadily Iran stepped in, even more so after 2000, after Oslo in particular. So one thing to keep in mind when blaming Iran for the actions of these groups, Iran is a late supporter of these groups. Second, by the time Iran came in to support these groups to fill in the vacuum as Arab states withdrew, these groups already had constituencies, they already had expertise, they already had resources and assets. Yes, Iran gave some. So some of these rockets that have been fired in more recent years have come from Iran, either directly or in terms of training and expertise, which matters as much, if not more. But we can't just say it's because of Iran. The other thing, however, is to remember what these are. These are highly inaccurate rockets that cause limited damage. It's not to say that, and I know the argument very well, if I lived in South Israel, I wouldn't be saying the same thing. True. But in terms of ability to damage, in terms of ability to shape events, in terms of ability to achieve influence, these are very inaccurate, weak rockets. So in terms of the balance of regional forces, it's actually quite minor in that sense. So it's not to say that it doesn't exist, but it has to be put in its broader context.
I like to look at political situations in terms of personalities. I'd like to mention Barack Obama. I feel, and I would ask for your concurrence, that he wanted to be the first president to make arrangements with Iran, and that's why he did it, because he didn't have to do it, and Iran might never have gotten nuclear weapons. And the second question is Israel a political football for Iran to use to gain influence in the Arab world? And the third question is, I believe Iran is not, it may have been at one time a democracy, but right now it is not a democracy, but a theocracy.
That's a lot of material right there. Very good points. On Obama, I think a variety of factors come in, and I'm reluctant to speak about his desire for legacy and all that because A, he's still in power, and B, that's a very psychological interpretation. I don't find that I'm particularly qualified to evaluate that aspect. What I do see, though, is that Obama's policy towards Iran has been consistent with his doctrine or with his approach to the Middle East. Obama has tried, and in some cases succeeded, in other cases not so much, to change the way the U.S. approaches the Middle East. A much narrower conception of the national interest, much more reluctance to use force on a large scale, much more suspicion towards the ability of force to allow you to achieve your ends. When you see Obama talking about Syria right now, the question you always see him either ask directly or it's very clearly between the lines when talking about enhanced U.S. military intervention in Syria right now is, show me how this ends well for me. By me, he means the U.S. Show me how doing more in Syria militarily will allow the U.S. to achieve its interests. And his answer to that is, I have not seen an answer to that. So he has a much more, in international relations theory terms, it's a much more defensive realist approach, narrow conception of the national interest, suspicion towards the use of force and its ability to allow you to achieve your ends. And his approach to Iran is consistent in that sense. He wants to disentangle the U.S. Obama came into power and he saw a very costly conflict for the U.S. with Iran. Not a military conflict, at least not directly, a conflict that could spiral. I never thought for a second Obama would attack Iran, but still a costly dispute from the U.S. that was pointless. So Obama has no intention, at least for now, of becoming good buddies with Iran. In any case, I don't think Iran is ready for that either. But at least from Obama's perspective, there's this disentanglement aspect. So where does the legacy fit in? That part I'm not sure, but I look at it more from his broader, worldview and how it applies to the Middle East. Israel, allow Iran to gain prestige, status, influence in the Middle East. Yes, that worked for a number of years. It doesn't work anymore. Around 2004, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, you could really see Iranian soft power benefiting from its rejectionism, from leading the resistance front, right? 2006 or 7, polls of the most popular leaders in the Middle East. Hassan Nasrallah, leader of Hezbollah, Ahmadinejad, and then you had another bunch of people who would, depending on how the question was asked or specific events, there was this status that Iran would gain from its leadership of the rejectionist front, from its support, right? Iran, unlike those cowardly Arab states who are lackeys of the United States, we in Iran, we support resistance. We support the Palestinian cause. That worked for a number of years. To what extent it brought concrete benefits besides prestige? Not that much, but that doesn't work anymore for a number of reasons. 2009, Iran's, and that starts answering your next question, but Iran's violent repression of its protests after the rigged, difficult, however you want to call them, elections of 2009. 2011, the Arab Spring. Did Iran have any role in shaping events in any of the countries affected by the Arab Spring? Not at all. So Iran was able to score political points, to score rhetorical points through its opposition to Israel, but when push came to shove, when it came time to actually shape events in these countries in terms of popular grassroots politics, it didn't have the assets to do that. And post-2011 showed that very clearly. My best example is Bahrain. There's one country where Iran should have been able to gain a foothold in the context of popular protest. It's Bahrain, majority Shia country ruled by a minority Sunni monarchy. Violent repression, all of that. Iran tried to sneak into Bahrain, massively failed for a number of reasons, one of them being the Bahraini opposition told Iran to butt out. There was no interest. And that, in political science or methodological terms, you call that an easy test or a crucial test. Iran should have passed that test. It didn't. That was the one it should have passed.
I have just a quick one from here. You talked about the strategic loneliness. I wish you could have touched upon the ECO, the Economic Cooperation Organization, and Iran's context and contact to the Central Asian countries, as well as India's collaboration with Iran for the naval build-up over there.
For the, sorry? Your last, India's cooperation with Iran for the?
With Iran on naval build-up over
Okay. I mean, I'm, and again, it's my more cynical take on security issues, but the ECO, the SCO, Iran is a member of these organizations. What does it actually achieve through that? The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Iran has been aggressively trying to get in for a number of years. It's now a member. It's now an observer, sorry, not a member. I mean, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has led to some cooperation between Russia, China, some of the Central Asian states in terms of resolving border disputes, but concretely today, it's not a counterweight to the US. Some people frame it like that. Some of their press statements after these statements frame it as that, but in practice, there's nothing concrete that comes out of that, and Iranian membership would not change that. And if anything, there's a lot of resistance in some of the member countries of these organizations to either allow Iran in or to make it something that Iran would like to make it, because they have different interests in that sense. And the SCO and the ECO are two good examples of that. India is interesting. There's a small school of thought that sees India and Iran as good potential partners. And if you just look at a map, remember my argument about Iran having allies in the periphery, not in its first ring of neighbors. So the first ring of neighbors, Iran has not had positive relations with any of them, with the exception of Iraq since 2003 for decades. Under the Shah, it was Israel, it was Ethiopia, sort of. Now it's Syria, it's Hezbollah. Why not India? Right? Don't India and Iran share a number of common interests? In practice, not much has happened between India and Iran. There is some cooperation, there is some trade in India too, not only in Iran. You do hear voices calling for greater cooperation on naval issues, on energy issues. There are a lot of people in India, very energy dependent country, very dependent on imports, I mean, calling for more from Iran. But on the energy issue, there's the Pakistan aspect, right? The idea that a pipeline could go from Iran to Pakistan to India, in practical terms, they just haven't figured out a way to do it yet. And the whole Pakistan variable here becomes very complicated because Iran and Pakistan have a lot opposing them. There's the Sunni Shia aspect, there's the ethnic aspect, there's the Baluchi rebels in border areas, there's competing interests in Afghanistan, but they've really kept a lid on that relationship. And one thing that's always amazed me is that the Iran-Pakistan relationship is not more tense than it actually is. There's a real effort on the part of both to be pragmatic and low profile about these potential problems. And where India comes in is to really, as a victim in the sense of Iran not really looking in that direction. From Iran's perspective, there's never been an investment in the relationship with India, whether on commercial grounds, on energy grounds, or on diplomatic grounds, and I don't see that changing very much. Iran was hoping that India would not participate in multilateral sanctions post-2010, and India did. India even reduced its energy imports from Iran after 2010 when the UN sanctions against Iranian oil came in. That was a major disappointment for Iran, and in a way it was a reality check that India is not actively seeking a strategic partnership with Iran.
I'm now going to ask Roger Corey of the Canadian Arab Institute to thank our speaker.
Thank you.
I always admire anyone who tries to explain anything that's going on in the Middle East. Heck, I've even lost track of the number of countries that are bombing in Syria today. But to do so eloquently, methodically, succinctly, and objectively is really amazing. And I really thank you for really informing us tonight and approaching such a complex region with such complexity of events that are happening today in such a, I mean, really, it was very easy to follow and very easy to understand. We at the Canadian Arab Institute and the Bill Graham Center have been offering this series, Perspectives on a Changing Middle East, because of all these complexities and the many changes that are happening in the region, and because it's important for Canadians to understand what's going on beyond, simplistic headlines. And that's, again, because our country, needs to become that honest broker, nuanced in its approach and multilateral in its approach to international politics. And by helping Canadians have a better understanding of the region, we hopefully return to that. So thanks very much for being with us tonight. Thank you, sir.